Hello, welcome to NERA's webinar, where we're going to walk you through our the hydrogen cluster opportunity. But first of all, I'm just going to set the scene a little bit. I'm Miranda Taylor. I'm the CEO of NERA, and I'm just going to set the context by which a little bit of background, and then I'll be handing over to my colleague Paul Hodgson, who will actually walk you through the process that we are putting in place for supporting some regional clusters, some technology-based clusters across Australia. So I'm just going to share my screen and put a presentation up now to set the scene. So today we will be covering the main points here. We'll be looking at Australia's hydrogen opportunity. We'll be looking at the advantages of technology, a technology-led cluster model. We'll be looking at who should apply and how. We'll answer some of your questions, and then I just remind you that the applications for initial expression of interest to us is 14th of October. NERA, as many of you will know, is one of the 6 industry growth centres set up by the federal government to support collaboration and innovation, and to try and drive a deeper advanced technology diversification of the Australian economy, and to drive the productivity and support the industry sectors that we have competitive or strategic advantage in through the deployment and commercialization of more technology and more advanced technology. We cover the energy resources sector, and that includes the energy transition and all of the technologies and capabilities that Australia is going to need to support that energy transition and position us to support the world in its journey to decarbonisation. So hydrogen can become an energy enabler for Australia, and it can help decarbonise industries and manage and smooth the take-up of renewables. And it can support higher value processing and manufacturing industries and improve our global competitiveness, and then finally enable us to export both energy and, importantly, the enabling technologies to the world. So not just exporting product, but actually exporting more of our know-how, our smarts and our technologies. But we need a realistic, strategic and coordinated approach to scaling the Australian hydrogen industry. And this must include a clear and agreed focus on the best uses and commercial outcomes for hydrogen. It will require investment in regional infrastructure and hubs. And I make the point that when we talk about clusters, we are not talking about the hubs that are outlined as a key component of the national hydrogen strategy, which are very much focused on areas, regional areas, where you've got such things as ports, skills, access to energy, other industries, cross-sector coupling. We're talking about small businesses who are offering technologies. So we're just making that differential, because sometimes hubs and clusters are used interchangeably. It also will require a focus on building a domestic market at the same time as looking at how we're going to scale from the demonstration and pilot projects to what will need to be large export size projects. Some strategic priorities for Australia, and these are not meant to be, this is not meant to be comprehensive, it's just a summary. We do need the strong coordination between the federal and state and territory governments, and we need a clear implementation plan. How are we going to actually deliver on the national strategy? We need a clear line of sight to the regulatory frameworks for project approval. It's not necessary that the legislation or the regulation isn't there, but it is disparate, and there isn't a clear visibility to what the regulatory requirements are. We very much need to build social license and take the community with us on the journey, and build international collaboration, and we've seen examples of that in the last week with the signing of the agreement with Germany, but also our strong relationships with Japan and South Korea and Asia as export market partners. Investment in the hubs and ports, to incentivize and support early production projects. And there are over 50 plus of these early pilot and demonstration projects all across Australia right now. And NERA has been working with CSIRO and with the Future Fuels CRC and the Hydrogen Council we will be launching a one-stop shop site hosted by CSIRO, where anyone can go to find out information on all of those projects across Australia. And ultimately, we aim to have links there to international projects as well. And it's modelled on the Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, which became a one-stop shop for all of those projects around the world. It will be energy solutions for remote sites such as mining. And it's really important that we work with Geoscience Australia and others to identify the storage caverns that are going to be such an important component of the hydrogen story and its strength as a storage medium into the future. Longer term, we need to support applications in industries which are going to be hard to electrify, because fundamentally electrification is still the biggest transformation that the world will be facing. But there are industries which will be hard to electrify, such as steel, cement and aluminium, and for Australia that offers a massive opportunity. We need to support application to heavy transport, rail, shipping and aviation, and importantly look at what we need to do to build towards those large scale projects for export. If we're going to be serious, we need to focus on where we can deliver the greatest economic and environmental benefits for ourselves and for the world. So Australia has identified a target of H2 under 2, and how are we going to achieve this? And clearly scale is the biggest driver of cost reduction, notably in the production and distribution of hydrogen and the manufacturing of the system components. And that's really what the clusters are all about. All of the technologies that are going to be needed to make up those system components, that is where the cluster comes in. This will deliver significant cost reductions before any additional impact from technological breakthroughs. And this was identified by the Australian Hydrogen Council in their report earlier this year. And they also identified that 90% of cost reduction for non-transport applications will be from scaling supply chains. So why a cluster? The National Hydrogen Strategy identified NERA as leading the establishment of a national hydrogen industry cluster to support. And when we talk about supply chains here, we are not talking about the product supply chains, we're talking about the supply chains that make up those system components. So all the technologies that will enable the hydrogen economy to unlock this broad economic value. And that is why we're differentiating it from the hubs that have been identified in the strategy. Clusters are a well-known international different business model for supporting small businesses and firms come together, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We are looking at a national network of regional technology clusters. We initially started to look at just one big national one, but we have come to the position that we believe that we need to support the emergence in a more organic way of local regional technology clusters. And then we would look to see those clusters linked to the regional hubs. And ultimately our goal would be to build that network into one super cluster or mega cluster that would be indeed a national hydrogen cluster. It focuses on innovation, collaboration, and high impact R&D. And the most cost-effective technology and infrastructure development. Clusters can help accelerate skills and capabilities and capacity development, and you can get efficiencies, economies of scale, and remove duplication of effort, and importantly, get cross-sector coupling, industry coupling, and circular economies. So what are clusters? They focus on innovation, value, and productivity, not just a cheap cost focus first. They are formed by a group of firms that are operating in the same industry sectors and value supply chains. They're market-driven and industry-led, not research-led, but research partners can participate in clusters. But fundamentally, the point of a cluster is to be about the businesses that are commercializing technologies. So they're technology and solution orientated. They encourage collaboration and drive faster skills and knowledge transfer, and encourage novel ways of combining. So partners, small businesses that participate in the clusters can work together to combine their offerings, and provides a different business model for providing an integrated service to customers. And we've seen that with our subsea energy cluster that we've been supporting in Western Australia. And that, as an example of a cluster, is now beginning to get global contracts, and offer combined services through the different businesses that participate. So it's a flexible and it's an adaptive business model. And I think that's the fundamental thing. It's a different business model for bringing small businesses together to make those system components. Clusters do matter, and all the European and international research shows that they really do drive things like higher wages, employment growth, and growth firms, and they help startups grow. And I would point people to the Norwegian experience. So if you go and Google Norway clusters, you'll find quite a body of material that talks about the Norwegian experience with clusters, and they have done it really well. And they did it originally in oil and gas, but they've gone now across many different sectors, including into renewable energy and carbon capture and aquaculture and a whole range of things. And they've very successfully sold their capabilities to the rest of the world. So it's a very good example. We're really about driving Australia up this quadrant on this map. We want to build our technologies to be beyond just local advantage and low complexity technologies, and move more into technologies that have a global appeal and a global market, and are further down the digital and other technology complexity, because that's where the real value for Australia will come from in the future, while not losing sight of the fact that we will still operate in the lower quadrant of low complexity, local advantage as well. It's just that we want to push far more of our offerings up that quadrant. We support a range of collaborative initiatives already that link into this hydrogen space, and they include the Future Energy Export CRC. We were the very, very early supporters and funders of the initial feed studies for that CRC. And indeed, we were the early supporters for the interoperability test lab that sits within the Future Energy Exports. Also, very strong supporters of the Future Fuels CRC, the Future Batteries Industry CRC, and the Race CRC, and the Blue Economy CRC, which is, we've got a cluster that is focused on ocean energy and looking at partnerships with industries like aquaculture and oil and gas and energy offshore. And we've got another cluster that we're supporting, which is looking at ocean energy, which is the Australian Ocean Energy Group. So a range of things. So now I'm going to hand over to NERA's GM, Paul Hodgson, who's going to take you through the cluster seed funding program that we've launched, and key details on the funding ERA. So thank you very much, and I look forward to talking more informally with you after Paul's presentation.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Great scene setting for something that we're all very excited with at NERA, around clusters and particularly the at the moment the hydrogen sector opportunities for Australia. I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully everyone can see that. As Miranda said, I'll run you through quite quickly, because we've got a lot of questions, and really this is your session. This is to enable you to ask, and hopefully we can answer questions about the expression of interest process, knowing that this is this is a new program. It's actually a new program for us as well. So really looking forward to that sort of discussion. And if you have any questions on the way through, please we put them into the Q&A function, and we'll endeavour to get through those questions. We've already got a number of questions that were lodged through the registration process, so keen to I'll go through those as well before we get to the live ones. So I think the key thing is really, and you know, a lot of the questions that we've had, a lot of the discussions I've had about, well, you know, there's the program's quite open in terms of eligibility, and I think one of the things I would say is really look at the aim of the program, and really direct your attention to that in terms of putting the most compelling expression of interest together. So the aim of the program is to support the development of hydrogen technology clusters across Australia to enhance local cohesion and capability in the hydrogen value chain. These clusters will accelerate and optimize the development of hydrogen technology and expertise. And I think Miranda made that point very clearly. This isn't about production clusters. This isn't about the hydrogen energy itself. It's actually about the capability, the technology in those supply chains and those systems that are going to deliver a hydrogen energy sector, both domestically but also globally. We want to maximize the Australian value add in those global value chains. So what is on offer? So we've, you know, looking to put up to $100,000 seed funding into emerging hydrogen technology clusters across Australia. We also are keen to work closely with those successful clusters to provide ongoing support and advice on clusters. We want to kind of get these clusters working closer together as well, so that they can learn from each other, they can develop relationships, and they can help form a national cluster network, so that we're providing not just the regional strengths, but we're also providing our national strengths and cohesion into the global marketplace. There's a lot of interest in Australia and hydrogen at the moment, and we really want to make sure that we're maximising that opportunity. We'll provide general guidance around the funding itself, and we'll also look to connect you to other interested parties where we can. Remembering that this is seed funding, this is the starting point. We're not expecting people to come forward with a fully formed cluster. Clusters are organic, grow organically, and they keep growing and they keep developing value and technology and new membership and new services and new opportunities. And that's what we see. This is really starting off that process. So really keen to build that in. So who should submit an expression of interest? So it can be a consortium or a single organisation. There's a few questions around this, so I'll answer that as well. But a single entity, on the condition that the entity is forming the cluster on behalf of a wider group of members and interested stakeholders. Again, this is a seed funding. Those members and interested stakeholders may not yet be committed enough to be part of a formal consortium, but where they are, we would want to see them committed to the cluster. I guess in that process, we'd much rather a single entity with a group of interested participants came forward, with the single entity being the applicant, rather than a consortium of just people that are signed up because they have an ABN and they may be interested down the track. We'd much rather keep it simple at this stage. So great to have lots of participants. If people are really committed and they want to be part of a consortium, that's great. Single entities can also apply, and all they'll need is an active ABN and a commitment to building a cluster. So what can the funds be used for? So, so we recognise it's not a huge amount of money. This is seed funding. We think that if there's not already a dedicated cluster manager, then it would be great to have one in place. It's really important to have a point person, someone who can be working with potentially volunteers and with supporting organisations to drive the cluster forward. Very difficult if there isn't that person in place, and it's a group of, for example, volunteers who have other roles as full-time jobs to gain traction. So we would sort of see whether it's in a part-time casual or hopefully even leveraged or even seconded from a partnering organisation, to have that dedicated person in place. Also gives NERA and the other clusters a point person to engage with as well, which is very useful. Cluster funds can be used for a whole range of activities to develop the cluster at this early stage. Put a few things there in there, and I'll address a little bit about that in the questions. We have to, NERA will request successful applicants to report on the use of those funds from an audit perspective, and we'll provide those cluster funding in instalments as agreed and linked to milestones. There may not be too many milestones, but but it's part of, that'll be part of the process. So the selection criteria. So really what we're looking for, and I think this is where the emphasis will be, you'll sort of see that the eligibility is quite open. This is really about how do you put a compelling bid together now for your region, for your focus, for your list of participants, and for your organization to demonstrate that you're going to be one of the best places to develop up a hydrogen technology cluster in Australia. So the demonstrated suitability of a hydrogen technology cluster to the specified region. So there may be projects, there may be other commitments, there may be some forward-thinking organizations in your region. You may have a whole bunch of assets and strengths and capability that potentially could be transferred from other sectors into the emerging hydrogen energy sector that would actually demonstrate that there's a good chance of success of your region developing up a hydrogen technology cluster. The capability and capacity to lead the formation and establishment of the cluster. So that is around the applicant. So sometimes if you've got a consortium, that might bring strength to it. If you're going to be relying on funding or resources as part of that capability and capacity, but they're not really listed as an applicant, that may weaken the position. Demonstrated support from other interested parties. So if it's just one organisation that says this is going to be a great idea and there's not much support elsewhere, but if there's a list of organisations, then that's going to strengthen the application. The ability to leverage other funds. So you don't need to leverage the funding, but again, it's up to $100,000. The more money, the better. So if you can leverage that other fund, that NERA commitment with other funds, then that's great. What we want to see is the applications and the emerging clusters start with quite a commitment to develop some significant momentum. Some risks and proposed control measures to mitigate risks. We really want people to understand that clusters are a long-term economic development, technology development, enterprise development goal, and that they can be challenging. Understanding how that can be mitigated, any of those risks can be mitigated will be great. And what are the expected benefits and outcomes for the individual participants, for the region, for Australia, in terms of the areas that Miranda really spoke about the hydrogen knowledge economy and us being in those hydrogen technologies value chains and supply chains globally. So one of the questions that's been asked actually is about recording. So the slides will be provided, a recording of the webinar will be provided. We'll also provide a link to a LinkedIn group. We've had a number of people already over the last couple of weeks ask about how can I find other people who are looking to bid? How do I participate in a cluster? That's obviously very difficult for us to provide that. So what we're looking at doing is setting up, and what we will do is set up a regional hydrogen technology cluster LinkedIn group. This will be established by NERA, but it won't be a place to go to ask questions of NERA, and we won't use any of the information in that LinkedIn group as part of the EOI evaluation process. So what's said in the group will stay in the group from a NERA perspective, but it's really a way of hopefully people being able to find each other. What we don't want is 300 individual entities competing for a small amount of funding through this cluster program. We'd much rather fewer and stronger applications, because the end goal is to develop up a national cluster network and a series of regional, or a collection of regional hydrogen technology clusters. And the real end game is to build Australia as a leading source of knowledge and solutions in the hydrogen sector, so we can be exporting using our own know-how and technology as well as complementing that with the rest of the world's. So I'll answer your question. So I can see there's a number of questions already coming through, but what I'll do is I'll start to answer some of the ones that that we've been asked already. So in the general sense, we've been asked about where NERA secures its funding from. So NERA is part of the Industry Growth Centre initiative, as Miranda mentioned. We're predominantly funded by the federal government through the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. We did receive about $15 million of project funding from the Commonwealth, which we've deployed with more than matching funding from industry. but predominantly the funding's as part of the Industry Growth Centre commitment. And there is some funding from other state governments, etc., but predominantly federal government funding. Are there any hydrogen clusters already operating in Australia? Don't think so. There's a lot of discussions. There's some hydrogen supply chains and hubs and projects happening. There's regional industry working groups around hydrogen. There's all those sort of things. But in terms of what we would call clusters, technology clusters, we don't think there are any. But who knows? They may come out through this process. And how much funding is available this round? It's up to $100,000 per bid, and that is an up to. It really depends on the quality of the applications we get, the number of applications, but I suspect we won't be able to fund more than a handful. We would really love to see some leveraged funding and other commitments as well as the program rolls out. Again, this is a starting point. What type of functions are envisaged by NERA to be included in the first regional clusters? Well, it's typical startup type activity. This is seed funding, so maybe having that point person, maybe some money towards that, maybe some office accommodation, maybe some business planning support, maybe some branding, maybe some governance work, maybe member engagement, a little bit of maybe research as to what happens, and a whole range of administrative costs that might go along. We'd love to see that money used really well, and part of, I think, NERA's role and with the other clusters will be to sort of guide on best practice around cluster development, understanding that in Australia we perhaps we haven't got as much experience as in other parts of the world, and so we'll try to ensure that that money's well spent through the process. In terms of participants, lots of questions about participants. So the mix of stakeholders required. There's no recipe here. There's no you've got 3 of this and 1 of that and 2 of that, therefore equals funding. It really will depend on the nature of the region, the nature of if you've got a focus on a technology, if you've and who your participants are that make sense, and their commitments. So so there's no magic formula there. Does NERA's focus include Australian SMEs in the component systems integration space as well as large established industry? This is actually less about large established industry and actually much more about the SMEs, the scale-ups, the startups, who are going to be in that systems integration and component space. So whether it's services or whether it's technology or whether it's advanced manufacturing, components, they're the kind of companies that we'll be looking to see as the core focus of developing the technology clusters. Would NERA be publishing listings of companies operating under clusters under the outcome of the seed funding round? It's likely that we would be publicising the recipients, including the consortium members if they're part of a formal consortium. In terms of the other listings of companies operating under clusters, a big part, as Miranda mentioned around the Norwegian example, is marketing as a group. It's about promotion of individuals as well as the cluster itself. So it's likely that we would look to, and the clusters themselves will be looking to promote and list those companies in a very public way. Is it possible to apply jointly with Australian local company or subsidiary in Australia? Absolutely. It can, as long as there's an ABN. What are the conditions for participation by European companies? Really interested in international connections. But again, if it's a salesperson who's basically just looking to sell electrolyzers into a region and that's their sole goal, it may not be a good fit with an Australian technology cluster. If they are looking to grow the supply chain in that region, work with technology companies, work with entrepreneurs, work with local researchers, potentially establish R&D facilities or training facilities, maybe look at manufacturing or looking at licensing or partnering, then absolutely they're the sort of things that we would love to see within a technology cluster application. Again, these things may happen down the track. We're not expecting everything to be signed up at the start of a seed funding program. Will university research groups be able to participate in the program, or can they partner with business as part of an application? Again, very similar to the European and the international one. Absolutely, I think universities will could be strong applicants, strong partners in clusters. Universities will be able to provide a steady flow potentially of intellectual property that can be licensed and can be utilised by technology companies and entrepreneurs within the cluster. They can provide access to facilities. They can provide access to potentially services such as independent verification. So we see universities as providing a flow of knowledge, which is going to be commercialized through these cluster arrangements. Research groups and universities may also have spin-offs, and those spin-offs may join the cluster. So certainly university groups could partner within a cluster and would boost that ongoing knowledge part of it. Details on cluster partner structures that will meet criteria, I'm not quite sure on that. As long as there's an ABN involved, then they can be part of a consortium. And, you know, there's likely to be a whole range of different structures and relationships going forward to build the cluster. Again, we won't be prescriptive around that. So in terms of regions, locality of hubs, I've got a question, can Toowoomba play a part? Absolutely, Toowoomba can play a part. It's a really open. I mean, one of the great things about the hydrogen opportunity for Australia is it is regionally distributed. There's capability right across Australia, and it's one of the things that's led us to look at having a regional hydrogen technology cluster seed funding program, is that we think that this is an area where lots of regions can win as part of an Australian opportunity. And so if your region has got the ambition, it's got the capability, and it can create some momentum for a cluster, then please make a bid. In terms of technologies, we're going to be reasonably agnostic around the technologies, and we really want bidders to come forward and tell us about that. So there's questions around, is there any hydrogen technologies particularly attractive, or do we have any specific hydrogen technologies in mind, such as trains, buses, non-mobility applications, industrial? There will be alternative carriers such as methanol or MCH. What about hydrogen as an enabler for steel or ammonia? All those things are possible within it. We're looking at actually the hydrogen energy opportunity. We know there may be different carriers, there may be different applications for that. We know that it's potentially not just in the production of hydrogen where there will be Australian technology and know-how that can be grown, but it'll be in the use of it. And if we can create better use opportunities, bring down the costs, make it more attractive as an alternative fuel source, then that will actually grow the demand for Australian production of hydrogen as well into global markets. But it might also mean that we've got Australian technology that can be scaled and replicated into global markets based off of some of the trials, demonstrations, and some of the great research and other work that's happening in Australia. So that was a quick whip through of the questions that were asked as part of the registration process. Hopefully that's answered a few questions you may have had in your mind already. But we might I think, Miranda, you're going to ask, go through the questions?
So we've got quite a lot of questions coming in. I think people might find that some of the early questions they've been answered, but I'll just work through some of them. So I think you've already talked about the roles that research organisations and universities can play, and I mean, I think I stated that in my presentation, that they definitely should be partners to it, but they shouldn't be the leaders of it. So we're very much differentiating clusters from CRCs, cooperative research centres, which while they are also supposed to be industry-led, often the universities play a very strong role in it, and we still see them as playing a role, but we keep reiterating that the focus of this programme is around small businesses, startups and technologies, and some big players as well. In the subsea cluster that we have a range of, there are some research organisations in the subsea cluster. There are a range of sizes of companies, from startups to larger ones. And then the big end users of the subsea technologies, such as the Woodsides, the Santoses, etc. Also, some of them are members as well, and but they have a strong relationship with the cluster, so that the cluster forms a very strong engagement with their end users, with the customers that their technologies are supplying. So then the next question for you, Paul, is around what we mean by regions and what scale of regions we are targeting.
Okay, thanks, Miranda, and thanks for the person that asked the question. Again, we'll be asking for a bit of definition around this from the applicant. What makes sense from your region? it could be quite small, but it could also be a statewide region. It could be across a number of local government areas, for example. It could fit something, but it's kind of what logically fits for that particular focus as a region. How does that region normally operate? What we don't want to see is a region come forward, an application come forward from one suburb, and then the next suburb over is also developing a cluster. Again, these should be ambitious. These should be able to be seen globally and seen nationally. And we would rather see much more cooperative behavior. What may happen is that the region is slightly large to start with, and through the seed funding process and through the development of the more detailed kind of cluster approach, is that you end up with maybe a number of nodes, or maybe you actually have some breakoffs into smaller regions that actually have specializations and they're all linked together. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. We're not going to say it's a local government authority or it's a state or whatever it is, but it does need to have some sort of geographic, I guess, boundary to start with. Understanding that we'll want to see linkages both across the country and also then internationally as well, to make sure that it remains relevant and complements other skills and capability.
Yeah, there's a sort of related question, which I think you've sort of addressed through the LinkedIn side, but how can people best identify the other players within their region to link to, so that they can collaborate? And maybe you should answer the question at the same time, given that this is such early in the stage and we've set the date of 14th of October, what our expectations is, because obviously this is still very early, so a lot of businesses are still finding each other. So what's our expectation? So what we might get by the 14th of October, the time frame over the next 12 months, because I think we're seeing this initial step is probably sort of over the next 12 months. So then how are we going to manage that going forward, Paul?
Again, starting point, I think part of it is a mixture. There's obviously the consortium, which might be a formal partners group that come together, but then there's also what are the strengths in that region and the areas of focus, and potentially, hopefully, some of the technology companies, some of the SMEs, some of the startups, some of the incubation and other clusters and groups that are already existing in that region that you're going to grow from. And I think that then becomes part of it. Not necessarily you've had all those conversations and that you put all those together in a formal partnership at this point, but it goes to the compelling case as to what that region's about and who you're looking to bring on board. And that membership will grow organically over time, quite, you know, if the cluster is going to be successful. So I think it's not about having everyone signed up as a consortium member. It's about, you know, who's there already. And so I would expect you to be doing some research. We'd be expecting you to be doing some research, talking to other stakeholders in your region, and finding out. And if you're talking to lots and lots of people and you're not finding that anyone's really doing this, then it's probably likely you're not going to find. It's probably likely that no one's doing anything. Regions generally are pretty closely aligned. They talk to each other a lot, but the LinkedIn group will be there as another source of information.
I think it's worth us stating that this initial round of seed funding that we're doing, it's very much about creating the connections and beginning to group and bring visibility to people who are working in this technology space and ultimately get these clusters forming. But, you know, international experience is that these things take 3 to 5 years to form and to get mature. And in that 3 to 5 years, they do need support funding. And therefore, NERA is very keen to work with the state governments and even local governments and other parties who may want to provide support for their regions. So we see this as being a collaboration, and what we're trying to do is put bring some early view of what the technologies companies are around Australia, enable and facilitate those to group, and ultimately provide a means for them to set up a different business model that they can engage with the regional hubs, and they can look at how they market themselves to the world ultimately. So I think it's important for us to say this is just the start, and that the funding that we're putting on the table is enabling connection. And we will expect that over the next, the first year will be really sort of getting those clusters to form, and then it will be the next two to 3 years that we will really work to build the business model. And the subsea cluster that we work with has now been in establishment for about 3+ years, and it's only this year that they're beginning to get the real traction into international. You know, they're now getting some international contracts, and they're working very closely with their customers here in Australia. So really beginning to get runs on the board and deliver value, but it takes a while to build it. And if you look at the hydrogen economy in Australia, we're at the beginning, not quite at the beginning, but because we've obviously had a hydrogen use for a long time. But in terms of this model, you know, we're early on the journey. So is there anything you'd like to add to that, Paul?
No, I think you've summed that up really well, Miranda.
So I don't think, you know, things like some of the questions here go to the detail, like should clusters budget for an auditor? Well, you know, ultimately yes, because if they're going to be a business, but at this early stage, I think it's more about getting the connections and forming. I don't think we need to answer those sorts of things. But one important question that does seem to come up is the issue of IP and sharing within the cluster, and the obligations to publish data or share IP within a cluster. And I'll give one quick response and I'll hand over to Paul. Generally in the clusters, IP still belongs to the owner of the IP. But what you would try and encourage is that there's some form of knowledge transfer that happens within the cluster, so that you can build up the skills and capabilities. But there's no requirement that you disclose private IP, you know, your IP. But I think the expectation is that the benefit that comes from the IP can be shared, and the capability and skills can be built. And the whole point of a cluster in terms of the individual members is that you do have visibility. That's the whole point of it, that as an individual small business or startup or company, you may not have clear, particularly if you're looking at international markets, there may be less visibility to you. But by being in a cluster is actually about making you more visible to the world. Paul, any more comments on that?
No, I think that's you know, a good summary.
How will communication between the clusters be facilitated?
Yeah, I think we're really looking to you know, form a really good group of the cluster representatives as part of the national cluster network. So we will look at whatever that looks like to actually bring those people together, probably virtually, regularly, to share from each other and to build up that network nationally.
Yeah. Can an organisation be a member of multiple clusters or submit more than one application?
I think it goes to the heart of what you're actually trying to achieve as the organisation. If you're trying to sell your product into multiple clusters, then just selling into regional clusters might not be an aligned commitment to growing the cluster. But it really depends. I mean, you may be an organisation with multiple sites around the country. For example, you may have a number of manufacturing facilities. You may have an R&D facility. It'll be, you know, what is the level of that commitment? So again, there's no right or wrong on that, but it's just what's the intent behind it, and what's the underlying asset or strategic framework that means that you'd be looking at multiple clusters.
So again, we've had another question about for the EOI submission. Should it be led by an industry partner? The person has commented, I think it would be better to let a research organisation to lead it. No, this is not initially about R&D. There may be R&D questions that need to be answered, and of course the research organisations would lead that. But the application to be a cluster is not led by R&D. It's led by it's led by businesses who want to form a business model of coming together as a cluster. But yes, of course, the research partners would work with the industry partners on working on any particular R&D gaps that the cluster feels that they want to work in as a group. It is a very different model to a CRC, a cooperative research centre, and I would just reiterate that. I think we've answered about local governments and others. How have existing clusters survived as sectors move from collaboration to competition in the more mature years? Well, I mean, again, I'll let Paul answer, but I would say that most successful clusters both compete and collaborate. So they continue to compete within the cluster, but they also are able to bundle and as I said earlier, provide novel solutions by working together. So a good cluster should not take away the ability to compete. And again, I would urge you to have a look at the Norwegian model, where they're still going very successfully, even in a very mature market.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree, Miranda. I mean, I think it's a really important question, actually, because it is one that people do worry about. Clusters are not forming an entity that's going to own all the IP. It's still very much about the success of a cluster is about the collective success of the participants. And yes, they will compete from time to time, but there are times when collaborating will make a lot of sense. Around particular technology, around talent, around market access, around an integrated solution, around having the right the scale to put together a consortium for a major market opportunity to promote themselves. There's a number of collaborative things that work well. There absolutely will be times when people will be competing, but that'll be done transparently and with an understanding as well that this is actually good for the cluster and for the participants as well. They remain commercial entities in their own right.
Yeah. So there's a question here about international participants. Can international organisations, whether they be technology companies or indeed research organisations, join an Australian cluster if they do not have a presence in Australia or possess an ABN here? Do you have a view on that, Paul?
Again, it comes down to the intent. So it can be an international, an international organization that has a local presence and is perhaps looking to grow their local presence could be a significant part of a technology cluster in Australia. Similarly, there could be an international link to maybe another hydrogen regional cluster or another energy cluster somewhere else in the world that's actually going to provide you with market access into international markets. Again, how compelling is it? What's the intent behind it? And how can that be scaled to deliver on the aim of the program?
Yeah. Maybe it's just worth talking a little bit about the skills and capabilities that can be generated with a cluster, Paul, do you think?
Well, I think skills are a really key part of it. And in a lot of cases, this is for clusters, one of those great collaborative opportunities. So if you're a single company and you're trying to get some skills developed, it's very difficult to potentially go to a vocational education or to a university to actually get those skills. But, for example, in our subsea innovation cluster or the ocean energy group cluster, if a number of firms can come together and aggregate some demand for skilling, then potentially that makes it a lot easier to get a course run in a particular region, to get some competencies developed, and it allows, so, it builds the foundation for the industry and for the cluster, which is one of those things that can be very difficult to do as a smaller company operating in a silo.
Paul, just another question. Are there other entities or organisations or indeed people out there other than technology companies or research organisations who might usefully participate in a cluster? That there's a sense that it could be a bit self-limiting when other companies offer different capabilities. So I think we would have the view that there are other organisations that might usefully participate, like skills organisations, for instance.
Yeah, that's right. So you could have skills organisations, you could have more economic development agencies. You could have enterprise development type services and business services and legal and accounting services, financiers. You could have people in the venture capital space. You could have a whole range of different people who collectively can actually grow the size of the pie and create a larger opportunity and build the capability of the participants of the cluster. So there are, successful clusters are very broad, but they do have that core. As Miranda said, with the cluster insights that have come out of Europe in terms of the success of the cluster, it's very much about building that core technology and economic capability that can be replicated and scaled and organically continues to grow in a region and into global markets. So, it requires it's a real team effort to be able to do that, and that's what we're looking for.
I'd just add, and I think we're sort of going to wind up in a minute, but I would add that both of the clusters that we have that we're supporting at the moment, the subsea cluster and the ocean energy, both of them are looking at co-investment in what I would call demonstration sites or market demonstration sites or test labs. So both of them, and I think this is the sort of thing that a cluster can get involved in. So that's the sort of other parties that might be involved, where you actually want to partner with someone to actually build some sort of demonstration test site. So that's another aspect to a cluster that I think can really add value. We've probably got about 5 minutes left. Paul, is that I think we've pretty much answered the questions as I can see them. That there's a lot that sort of repeat each other. So is there anything that you would like to just finish, some concluding comments for people to take away and to think about before they put their submission? And we would, I think, want to make the point about not trying to make this initial level of funding and therefore the submissions too onerous, and that the decision making on this is not being influenced by a political, NERA is independent. And we have an independent board, and it's not a political decision-making process, and it is meant to be light touch initially because we're trying to grow the opportunity. I think it's really important that we want some rigor, but at the same time we don't want it to be ridiculously onerous at this early stage, because we are talking early stage connecting. So is there anything you'd like to just add to that?
Look, I think one of the things, and just really looking through the questions that are there, this is one part of the overall development of a national and a global hydrogen energy sector. The cluster doesn't have to be all things to all people. This is a part of it. There is project funding out there through places like NERA. There is scale-up funding for projects through Clean Energy Finance Corporation. There's a number of cooperative research centers that provide funding in the enterprise development space. There's people like the Entrepreneurs Program. There's just about every state and territory has project grants for hydrogen. There's a national hydrogen strategy that's looking at 57 different strategic actions, including in the standard space and the regulatory space and the skills space and the right across. So it's important to not think that this cluster is about doing it all itself. This is about a part of it. This is about the supply chain, not about the projects, but how do we leverage all that capability that we're building in Australia, our market position, which is growing day by day. How do we fuse that together to maximize the economic opportunity? And we really want to see that happening through regions. We think that works really well. We've got a lot to learn around clusters in Australia. NERA's had some great success with Seeker and with the Ocean Energy Group cluster, and we're supporting SME export hubs out of Australia, and we're really looking to do it in hydrogen. The only other thing I would say is that the eligibility is quite open. This is really about a compelling case. So think about why your region, why your participants, what's the size of the prize, and how can you do something to actually leverage all that capability, continue to grow that capability, and build a hydrogen knowledge sector for Australia so that we're known as a leading source of knowledge and solutions in hydrogen, not just a producer, user, and exporter of hydrogen as an energy source. So hopefully that's gives people an understanding. So, and it is just an expression of interest, and it is a starting point. Put your best foot forward. You've got 4 weeks, I think it is, or just under 4 weeks. There's no advantage in getting in an early application. I'd be thinking about what can I do between now and the 14th of October to build the best case possible.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for staying on for the hour and engaging with us. And we really look forward to going on this journey with you. Yeah, all the best, and meet you on the other side of the virtual world.